As you can see from the introduction, I've done most of my work in the area of immigration law, but at Legal Aid Chicago, our Immigrants and Workers' Rights Practice Group actually has 4 disciplines: immigration, human trafficking, employment, and our farm worker team, which has been part of Legal Aid Chicago since the 1970s. So I've been doing more work in the farm worker area in the more recent years as the director. And I'm here to give a little bit of information today that I hope is helpful to you and stimulate some conversation on the issue of heat standards and heat protection laws and policies in the United States. So for top line goals today, we want to sort of understand the general information about how heat impacts farm workers in particular, what states have created standards or laws, some for heat and cold, some for indoor, some for outdoor. And then comparing the different states' legislations and policies to see how they look next to each other, examining where we are with the potential for a federal heat standard policy, and then just hopefully opening up with time for some conversation. I'd love to hear from some of you with questions and comments. Actually, a couple of important aspects to heat standards and heat illness prevention laws are the issues of implementation and enforcement. They're equally as important as what's in the policy or what's in the law. But we don't have time to delve into that too much. And in fact, it's a fairly new area in terms of research and examination. So I'll give a couple of examples to kind of show how some of this has worked. But for the most part, we're going to talk about just the standards and policies that exist today. Next. So Humberto Casarrubio Sanchez was a client of our agency, and he came to Illinois in 2011 as a corn detasseler. I don't know if you all know what corn detasseling is, but essentially it's for pollinating corn for hybrid seed. And as a practical matter, what it means is that workers go up and down long rows of very tall corn and shakes the plants to pollinate the corn. And in 2011, Humberto and his brother came on special visas, H-2A visas they're called, to work in corn detasseling in Illinois. He was not at his work for very long, and on the day that this event occurred, it was 100 degrees out. I've seen those cornfields, and when you're inside the fields, it's probably even hotter because the heat is not, there's no air coming in, so it's probably much hotter than 100 degrees. Normally, when people go up and down these rows, there's a supervisor at each end counting how many people go in and someone at the other end counting how many people go out. Oftentimes, they're told to have buddies or partners. And on this particular day, Humberto's brother came out at the other end of the field, and Humberto didn't come out. So he notified the supervisor, and after a time, when he didn't come out, they started looking for him, which eventually led to the fire trucks coming and creating a more extensive search for Humberto. They did not find him. And in fact, there was a suggestion that maybe he left the field and came into the country on that visa so he could just leave and go live and work somewhere else permanently in the United States. But in fact, 50 days later, when the corn had sort of died and there was more visibility, they did find his body. So he left his wife and children in Mexico. And this was obviously a very, very sad situation, but it's not an unusual one. There are cases like this across the country. And as I'm sure you know, heat can kill and has killed dozens of US workers and has injured them as well. According to a 2024 US Labor Department study, those figures that we do have are vastly undercounted each year. So a sad way to start, but an important focus on what we're going to be talking about today. Next. So we're not going to go through too much of the sort of medical issues related to heat exhaustion and heat stroke. I think we generally know that too much heat can cause someone to become faint, to oversweat. Their bodies are sweating so much if there's not enough wind and there's very high humidity, their bodies can't cool themselves. they can have cramps, and have a rapid pulse. So when that becomes even more severe, it can turn into heat stroke. And generally, the most important thing to pay attention to, I'm not a physician, I know we have physicians listening, but from what I've read, one of the most important factors to pay attention to that can result in heat stroke is body temperature. Here on this visual, it says body temperature above 104, but in fact, much lower than that can result in heat stroke. There's two things I wanted to mention about this. And the first is that we generally think about heat exhaustion and heat stroke because it generally is sort of a one-time event where somebody in relationship to their exposure to heat has one of these situations, medical situations occur, exhaustion or stroke. But in fact, they're not only single events. Exposure to heat over time can be very problematic to the body as well. So one physician stated it this way: for long-term farm workers, every day they're getting a little hit to their kidneys, and over time they run the risk of chronic kidney failure. So when you're looking at legal measures and protective measures, we really need to keep remembering not only long-term impacts, but short-term impacts, but long-term impacts as well. Next. These are some of the risk factors and structural measures that I think are the most basic. We'll see some more later to issues related to looking at what are the factors that can be in play when excess heat occurs, and what are the structural issues that can prevent this. And it's very clear that if the measures are taken, these kinds of illnesses are clearly preventable. So gender, how much hydration, how much strain the person has, what the temperature is, what kind of work they do. I wanted to point out the piece rate issue in agriculture because it hasn't faded, and although many of us would like for it to go away, many farm workers don't want it to, because it is a means by which they can try to make more than their hourly rate while they're working, based on how many, for example, bushels of potatoes or tomatoes or acres they cover. But that can cause someone to overwork because they're trying to move as fast as they can. So the piece rate payment, if you're working under it, can really impact somebody if heat is excessive. And then the most obvious things: access to water, changing work hours and schedules. Most of us have probably seen a lot of media attention on India, for example, which has extremely high temperatures, and people are starting to work at 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning and ending very early. That also is in some of the heat policies as well, where in extreme measures, employers should be changing schedules as to when they start. In Illinois, for example, my experience has been that corn detasselers, for example, might get up at 3 o'clock in the morning, start at 4, 4:35, and finish at 2:30 or 3. So sometimes those are sort of built-in schedules as well. Reducing sugar consumption, taking breaks in shade, and most importantly, improving access to medical care, because so many farm workers are in distant locations and don't have immediate access when a problem occurs. There is, so we can go to the next one. As I said before, I've read that there's really not a lot of research on the issue of heat impact for farm workers, but there really is a fair amount of research. It's not always specific to agricultural workers, and it's not always in the United States, but there's definitely enough research to involve yourself and learn more about the impacts. These are just some top line ones that I thought would be worth mentioning. In this NIH study in 2015, they determined that agricultural workers are 35 times at greater risk of a heat-related death than other workers. So that's extremely high. With climate change, that might even be higher, and this was in 2015. In 2022, the end result of this study was just that there was an urgent need to expand future research. So for all your researchers out there, you can start thinking about what might be good research. on vulnerable agricultural communities in particular and migrant workers to do exactly what's happening or states are attempting to have happen through these laws, which is to have effective interventions to protect communities from heat stress and these really serious implications from access or excess heat. I want to talk a little bit about this 2025 data and what has been really interesting is, let's just go back for a second. So as a general standard, the World Health Organization and the US government say that people should avoid pushing their body core temperatures beyond 100.4 degrees for extended periods. And this particular article in the Washington Post talked about a researcher by the name of Roxana Chicas, who is an assistant professor at Emory University's Woodruff School of Nursing. And her research is based on a 5-year, $2.46 million grant from NIH. Her team is and has been collecting data from Florida and I think some Georgia agricultural workers. What she found in her initial study of over 200 ag workers was that they routinely passed the threshold of 100.4 degrees while they're working on the job. So in order to carry out this study, I didn't see the sensor that they claim in the article is like a pill-sized thermometer that the workers swallow, but I did see a sensor that they attach to their bodies. But apparently, they swallow this thermometer and also use a monitor on their body strapped to their waist to also assess their activity while they're working, how much they run around, how much they work, how long they're out there. And it measures the core temperature of the body every 30 to 60 seconds. So in the one example they gave of a woman, agricultural worker, she started the day at 98 degrees, but by the time she clocked out at 2:30 in the afternoon, her temperature was 102.7 degrees. And the study found that the only time her temperature dropped, and importantly, was when she took a half-hour break at noon. And the data found that in total, 49% of the core body temperature of at least 104, 49% of the workers reached that core body temperature of at least 100.4 Fahrenheit, which is similar to a fever for an infection. So really important research. I didn't find an actual final study on that research, but I did find a second study out of her research, and that's the second one, cooling interventions among agricultural workers. And this pilot study worked with a number of workers. I want to say like 86. I'm not entirely sure of the number. And basically what they were in fern growing nurseries, field crops, landscaping. It was a variety of agricultural work. And 66% of the people surveyed and carrying out this pilot study were female, which is a little surprising because most of the farm workers we see here in Illinois are male. The median hours of worked each day was 7.4 hours. And so in the control group, there were 4 things that they analyzed. Some wore nothing but the clothing they would normally wear to work. Some wore a bandana around their necks that they could regularly dip in water, wring out, and wear around their necks. Some wore a cooling vest, and some wore both the cooling vest and the bandana. And what they found was the individuals who were best protected and whose temperature remained the most stable were those who were wearing just the bandana. What they found was the area that it cooled around their neck was helpful. And the reason the cooling vest was not helpful was because it weighs 5 pounds. And so that made work actually harder. But the suggestion was that it's possible that the cooling vest could help more if they wore it at the break and not while they were working. So there have been, and I would continue to watch this research and see how it moves forward and what they produce from it to get a better sense about these really practical aspects of heat impact for farm workers. Okay, next. Okay, so now we're going to start to review some of the existing state heat standard laws. And I want to give an acknowledgement to the University of Vermont Law and Graduate School Center for Agriculture and Food Systems, because I've taken a lot of the information that I'm going to present from their December 2025 report here, Preventing Heat Illness in Agricultural Settings. This is an excellent and comprehensive report. And I think it's the best place to start if you want a full examination of state-by-state laws and policies, including numerous resources for additional information. Okay, next. One of the things that's important to pay attention to when you're looking at how plans get implemented is to understand whether they're coming through and deriving from an administrative agency or whether they're being legislated through the legislature, the state legislature. So some states have their own OSHA policies and they enact those under those OSHA policies. And that would take place through perhaps the Illinois Department of Labor if they had a state OSHA policy. And so what your connection might be, if you're in a state where this might happen, is you would want to be connecting up with that state agency to see how that's developing. And if you're an advocate or stakeholder, what opportunities there might be to participate in the development of that policy. When it's not a state OSHA policy and it's going through the legislature, that's a very different situation. You are going to be examining the legislation, watching it go through committees, talking with different representatives, examining, just as you would if you're working through an agency, who the stakeholders are and how you might be able to shape it. But interestingly, when it's through legislation, you have both the legislation and generally after that, rules that are made. And so it's important to pay attention to how it's developing, because there are state standards that in legislation, in their legislative form, are actually broad and not very specific. And they intend for the agency to then flesh out the detail. And so you might want to be involved or be paying attention to both of those things, but you may see a statute not have a lot of detail in it, and it might pass. But if it doesn't have a lot of detail, you really want to be looking at the rulemaking process to see how those things are then going to be defined. A really good example of that is the latest heat standard legislation that was passed in April of this year in Virginia. So I think I attached that to the resources at the end of the PowerPoint. And I think it's a really good read to get a sense of a statute that's broad and undefined, because it basically has three definitions: who's an employer, what's heat illness, and who's a worker. And then it basically says the Safety and Health Codes Board shall adopt regulations establishing standards designed to protect workers from heat illness during indoor and outdoor work. Such standards shall include requirements for each employer to provide water, access to shade, or climate-controlled environments when practicable, rest periods, acclimatization to working in heat, and effective training regarding illness, and to implement high heat procedures when temperatures equal or exceed 80 degrees, and establish efficient emergency responses. It has a little bit more about filing a complaint, but that's kind of it. So a lot of this is going to be fleshed out when the Safety and Health Code boards get together. It does have a provision that says the board shall convene an advisory panel. So you want to pay attention to whether the legislation has something like this, because you might want to be on it, or you might want to know who's on the advisory panel, of at least half of which membership shall be employee advocates and employee stakeholders. So it's just a good example of a more general statute, but keep that in mind if you are in a state where things are developing, to watch how these things develop and how stakeholders might get involved in that process. Okay, next slide. So we now have 9 states that have enacted heat illness prevention requirements, and those are the states there. One thing that's pretty interesting is that California's plan, which has been amended, and there are some amendments that they are trying to add now, but it started in 2005 and 2006. And from that time until Virginia's in April of 2026, you have these 9 states developing their plan. So that's, that's 25 years, 25 years, 20 years of work. And so you can see that, and it's only 9 states, right? So there's a lot of work to do in other states. New Mexico has pending measures. California has a separate indoor and outdoor rule. I'll talk to you about what they want to, how they want to amend theirs. And Illinois, which we'll talk about in more detail later, has proposed legislation for both heat and cold, but that legislation did not move forward after last term. Generally, OSHA relies on its own act and its general duty to protect workers from serious hazards to where heat would fall into it, but there's no federal provision right now for heat protections. And so state developments become more and more important. So I already talked a little bit about the Virginia statute. California wants to amend its statute to require employers to distribute copies of their heat illness prevention plan to employees and to add more stringent acclimatization procedures for new and returning employees. Wisconsin had a plan that sunset in 2023. And when the Biden administration was developing a federal law for heat protection, it kind of waited in the wings. And as it saw that that wasn't moving forward in 2025, Wisconsin readopted its heat plan. The surrounding states, Illinois, Iowa, Michigan, do not have state standards. So Wisconsin kind of stands alone right now. And it's important to note the really important agricultural states that don't have a heat protection plan and how much work has been done to prevent those plans from being developed. So Texas is one of the hottest states in the country, as you can guess. Florida as well, and both states have thousands of agricultural workers. But both states have passed legislation called Death Star statutes, which permit local governments, which prevent local governments from issuing regulations, including labor regulations, without the state approving of them. So Florida has also passed one of these Death Star laws and specifically targeted heat protections, including worker training and emergency response protocols. Arizona passed heat protection standards for outdoor workers, but only those who have contracts with the city or are working on city land. So 3 really important states for agricultural workers not only don't have plans, but pass laws to prevent plans from going through. And we'll see a federal statute that is trying to do the same related to OSHA's and the federal government's attempt to create a heat standard. Okay, next page. I found this map. It's a little tiny bit outdated, but it came out in July of 2025. And it was actually, I believe the reference is like a lobbying business company that kind of, one of the reasons I put it in is because, it's not only advocates who represent farm workers like my agency, but also businesses that are paying attention to this and may want assistance in the regulatory or legislative or administrative process from a firm that helps them advocate for themselves. So the 2 states that are missing here that should be in dark blue are now Wisconsin and Virginia. But I thought it was helpful to get a sense of what it looks like from this map. It's the only map I've seen that sort of covers it all. Okay, next slide. So based on the report from University of Vermont, and we've already kind of covered some of this, these are the 9 factors that they think should be included in any plan. So you have to consider, who does it apply to? Some only apply to agricultural workers, some apply to all workers. So what's the scope of the law? The larger it is, the harder it might be to be passed because there's more stakeholders involved. What are the heat standard triggers? Like, what's the degree and temperature, and how do you measure it to trigger the requirement for action to be taken? Water, obvious. Shade and cool down, obvious. Rest. Acclimatization is a really important one, and it's particularly important because many farm workers don't want to acclimatize. They may come on a visa, and if the acclimatization program says you're going to work for 2 days first in the first week, 3 days in the second week, and 4 days in the third week, if they're not being paid for those days they're not working, it may be difficult to get them to acclimatize. So that's a really important factor. And very often farm workers are impacted by heat when they have not acclimatized. Like I've seen a number of deaths occur in the first days of work. Training, monitoring, and employer plans are also really important. I see my time is moving, so I'm going to skip the ones that don't take as much time. Okay, next. So water and cooling requirements, here are just a couple of things that have popped up in various plans. So provide cool drinking water at no cost. And one benchmark has been 1 quart per worker per hour. One of the biggest issues about water is maybe not that it's there, but how close is it to the farm workers to be able to access? And how clean is it? Because sometimes they're near the latrines and they're not connected, they're not kept separate. So making sure that it's clean is also really important. Shade or climate controlled rest areas, once these thresholds are hit, must be included. And rest areas have to be large enough for workers for all workers to access when they're on a break. There's a really interesting picture in one of the slides that we saw and I had not seen before. It's basically kind of like a truck that's a cooling spot. You'll see that shortly. Okay, next. It's on this slide. So that looks like a shade area for workers, which I've never seen anything like that before. It's kind of interesting. So rest breaks, they should be paid. And that is going to be a problem if they're not, right? Because workers don't want to take 20 minutes or 15 minutes off of their time if they're not being paid. So it's essential that the rest breaks are paid. And then more rest is triggered the higher the temperature. So some states have, a 10-minute break if the temperature is 80 or more every 2 hours, but if it's 90 or 95 or above, the rest breaks have to be more frequent. So those are some distinctions that you'll see in some of that distinguishes some of the state plans. Again, acclimatization. So new or returning workers must be gradually exposed to heat, and returning workers is really important. Last year in 2025, a Mexican H2A worker in Florida suffered heat stroke and died 8 days later, but he was in his 8th season as a farm worker. So he knew the work really well. On the day he died, it was 95 degrees. So the concept that a new worker is the only one who needs to acclimatize is wrong. Anyone coming needs time to acclimatize, especially, we might presume that workers coming from certain countries are used to these high heats, but they're not. I mean, they may not be, they may be, but very often they're not. So we shouldn't make any presumptions about workers already being acclimatized. Okay, next. So this is a pretty intense slide. We're certainly not going to go through all of it, but I wanted to go through a couple of them. So these heat trigger metrics are usually in two degrees. Like the first one is just what implicates general measures, and then the highest heat trigger implicates more mandatory measures. What's important to pay attention, and most start at 80 and as the initial trigger, and then the high heat trigger is either 90 or 95. But how you measure it is also different in plans. So some do it by the ambient temperature, some do it by the wet bulb globe temperature. Nevada doesn't have a numeric trigger. They make their decision initially by classifying the type of work as the trigger for either rest, usually rest or cooling down. So those are very interesting, and it would be interesting to know in research, like whether any of these things are more helpful than others. And then some acclimatization periods in California, Maryland, Oregon, and Washington can be up to 14 days. Colorado only has a 4-day acclimatization period. Um, the rest break cadence, as I've mentioned before, in California and Colorado, it's 10 minutes every 2 hours when it's 95 degrees or above. Maryland, Oregon, and Washington, it's 10 minutes every 2 hours at 90 degrees. And then it scales up to 15 minutes if it even goes higher than 100. So really technical, small points, but it can make a big difference. And you can see that they vary. One thing I wanted to mention is that, you know, as we've seen with tornadoes, hurricanes, and flash floods, there are no national cell phone text warnings for heat. The National Weather Service does issue official heat advisories and extreme heat warnings, but it's up to like local weather stations, local news stations, and weather apps. But there are no emergency text pop-ups for heat nationally. And but even if we thought that that would be an important way for farm workers to be notified, they're not always carrying their phones with them, and many, at least those workers who come from other countries, often don't have data plans and only do their communication through WhatsApp when they have Wi-Fi. So there are some interesting points there that might be worth considering if heat notifications do become of interest and materialize in a heat protection plan. Okay, next. Just again, looking up and down, not left to right. So we already went through this, but California and Colorado's high heat trigger is higher. It has to be 95 degrees Fahrenheit for these mandatory triggers of more increased rest and water, etc. But in Maryland, Oregon, and Washington, it's 90 degrees. Minnesota's protections only apply to indoor workers. They don't have an outdoor worker plan. But Wisconsin and Colorado, their protections only apply to agricultural workers. So it's really state by state. You have to look to see how they vary. Oregon addresses cooling. It's the only state that addresses cooling in employer-provided worker housing. So a really important factor that people may want to pay attention to as they develop plans in their states. And then Nevada has some restrictions about how many employees the employer has to have for this to apply. Okay, next. If you're really interested in understanding shade, both historically and as a natural resource, I would refer you to the book by Sam Block called Shade, the Promise of a Forgotten Natural Resource. It has a whole chapter on the development of heat protections in California. And as you can see from his book, it's really interesting. It goes through, building porticos in Europe so that people outside buildings could go to market, but they'd be covered and shaded. It's a really interesting book. But what was interesting about the California regulations once they passed their legislation was how to define shade. And so I thought it was really interesting to kind of look and see how California defined shade. Shade means the blockage of direct sunlight. So there you have it. But the rest of it is really interesting. One indicator that blockage is sufficient is when objects do not cast a shadow in the area of blocked sunlight. Shade is not adequate when heat in the area of the shade, like the shade that comes off somebody's pickup truck at the job site, defeats the purpose of the shade, which is to allow the body to cool. For example, a car sitting in the sun does not provide acceptable shade to a person inside it unless the car is running with air conditioning. Shade may be provided by any natural or artificial means that does not expose employees to unsafe or unhealthy conditions and does not deter or discourage access or use. So there's a whole definition of shade. I thought that was really important. And not all plans have a definition of shade. That's in California. It may not be in one your state may develop. But if we go to the next slide, we'll see that really what is, sorry, this is the key takeaways. What I wanted to say was in other plans, it's called, defining what rest means or what a cool down area is. It may not say shade, but they're working on the same principles. So the key takeaways are that states share a common framework, but they can differ in their scope and their enforcement. That they all have some kind of trigger threshold and heat metrics, but they may vary how they measure it and what the heat level is. Stronger protections may be needed for high-risk workers and work conditions, and federal action now remains uncertain, so state rules can be a lifesaver for farm workers. Next. We had proposed heat legislation in Illinois, which is probably going to come back in some way, shape, or form. And as I said at the beginning, it didn't pass. It didn't even come up for a vote. But I think the Illinois legislation is a really interesting example because it gives you an idea of how people are trying to build on prior programs and policies and statutes to improve on the next piece of legislation. So if you move to the next piece, the basics of the bill are pretty similar. The Illinois bill was covering, it would have covered both extreme heat and cold. And a lot of stakeholders think that that is a really important decision when they begin to look at proposing legislation. Is it too much to take on heat and cold? Is it better to start just with heat or better to start just with cold? Is it better to start with ag workers as opposed to other workers? Or so those decisions are important in terms of how bills get formed. The Director of Labor, the Department of Labor, has to establish a plan. Employers have to establish their own plan, following the director's plan as a model, and the employees must participate in developing the plan. That's not in any other statute that I've seen. So that's pretty interesting. One thing I wanted to mention is Illinois does have a 1-day rest in 7 Act, which mandates employers to give their employees 24 hours of rest at least every 7 days of work, but it exempts farm workers. Okay, next. For Illinois, the heat threshold is 80 and 90, employer requirements, and then regular monitoring. So not all plans have monitoring. This proposal did. Next. We're not going to go through all of this. I want to leave room for questions, but there are a lot of important elements to the Illinois proposal. Whether they'll stay in the next time around remains to be seen. But one area that I thought was really interesting was that there is an element to this proposal that allows the worker the right to refuse work. So that's not in any plan I've seen before. And it says that employees are legally protected to refuse work if they perceive the temperature conditions to be excessively and immediately dangerous to their health. It's really like the OSHA standard, without facing pay loss or reprisal. So that's a really interesting development that I haven't seen in other plans, and it'll be interesting to see whether that continues and whether individuals will actually take advantage of that. Next. So Illinois, no employer is exempted. There's no definition of shade in the bill, sort of as a comparison. The triggers I mentioned are 80 and 90, and there are some minimum requirements that are less specific than the rules by other states. So that's where it is, and hopefully it'll keep moving, but we'll see how that moves forward. So now we're just going to take a quick look at the federal landscape for a national heat standard. Next, thank you. In 2022, OSHA launched a program seeking to double heat-related workplace inspections. Between 2022 and 2024, they conducted 7,000 heat-related workplace inspections and investigated 147 heat-related deaths and sent 1,400 warning letters. By the summer of 2024, the agency proposed a federal heat protection standard through rules. But in 2026, the agency slowed down its Biden-era proposals. And at this time, the agency has indicated its intent to finalize the rules by the end of 2026, with expectations for a final standard in October of 2027. So if you could move to the next slide, we still don't have a federal heat illness standard, and we're not sure what's going to happen with that proposal from 2024. Texas and Florida have preempted local ordinances, making it very difficult to legislate issues related to heat for workers. And then there are still some gaps that need to be addressed related to piece rate work, protective clothing, and protective gear. But research suggests a standard for work rest protocols still may be insufficient to keep body temperature safe. So there's a need for a real holistic approach to protecting workers. And then finally, I thought it was, sorry, last slide. One more. Yeah, that's it. Thank you. I think it's really unfortunate, but there is a bill called, ironically, the Heat Workforce Standards Act that is in the House and the Senate. And that legislation would prohibit the Department of Labor and OSHA from finalizing, implementing, or enforcing a proposed federal standard on heat injury and illness prevention. So like some states, there is at least a pending bill to try and prevent the agencies from creating these standards. It remains to be seen what happens. The House Education and Workforce Committee approved legislation along party lines last week to prevent the Department of Labor from finalizing these proposed protections. So it remains to be seen what's going to happen in the federal landscape. So the last page are just some additional resources that I thought if you wanted to look at would be additional to what's in the PowerPoint. And the University of Vermont report also has many resources for referral. So that's what I was going to share. I wondered if anyone had any questions or comments. I'm happy to take some questions. Linda.
I want to thank you so much for this lecture. This was a really fantastic lecture. I wish we taped it, and maybe we'll ask you if we can record this lecture at some time. For me, the best part of it was the way you demystified policy in general, like how policy is written, how it comes about, how details get incorporated and so on. And then, of course, just the lay of the land as far as what's going on with heat policy in the United States, and even really contributing to us ideas about the type of research that's needed and still needed, really. I'm impressed with your interpretation of the research studies that you read, and also your description of the pathophysiology of heat. I think you're 360 degrees on it. I don't really have a specific question except that it would be good to do a solid brainstorm from your perspective and those of your colleagues and legal folks about the type of research and outreach that we could do in order to support policy and really win over legislators and voters and so on in this realm.
Yeah, I mean, thank you very much for your comments. Again, it's this kind of mix, and I'm not a researcher, so that's why I'm kind of a little bit gray on some of this, and that is that I think there is good data out there to use, but there's more data to be found. I'll give an example, like workers' comp claims might be interesting to research for potential heat injuries. We had a client call us the other day, and he didn't say like, hey, I was injured from the heat. He said, hey, I came back from work, and 10 minutes after I got back, it was a really hot day. I had a really bad nosebleed. I went to the clinic and I got care, but should my employer be paying the bill? And so the question is was that a heat illness? Is that, my answer was that seems to be related to your work, so you should bring the bill to your employer. But workers' comp is going to be a place where we might we might see injury issues that aren't being reported to their employer, but are being reported through medical care.
Great, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Do other folks have questions?
Yeah, I just
One
want
thing,
to
oh, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. I just want to highlight a thing by Imani in the chat that she is interning at the Academy of Social Insurance this summer, and
Oh,
they just released their most recent report on workers' compensation benefits, cost, and coverage. So would
thank
be an
you.
interesting report to look at.
Yeah, one area that I think is just so interesting is enforcement. Like, how well are these plans working? So I looked some stuff up, and there was a big case in California in December of 2024 where an employer was fined $276,000 for penalties for failing to provide water, shade, training, forcing employers to purchase their own drinking water, which I think probably happens a lot. But if I were a worker, I'd probably try and bring mine, because if it's not on site, you want to have it, while working in temperatures exceeding 95 degrees. But I also talked to a colleague in Colorado, which has a relatively recent statute, and she said they're just in the very beginning stages of enforcement. Even, workers are afraid to report, as they're afraid to report many things because of potential retaliation. And they've created, Colorado Legal Services has created an anonymous reporting form that the state has partially adopted to allow people to report anonymously. You can do that in Illinois with pesticides, because I know I've done it in my office anonymously, but then they won't get in touch with you to tell you what happened because it's anonymous, right? They don't know it's you. So it was really interesting to see the extreme of like a very severe penalty versus, the fledgling concern about outreach to workers to even consider how they might report. They definitely are telling workers, take pictures and gather evidence. So for example, if there's no water around and you're far out and it's 95 degrees, take a picture to show there's no water there. So it's a lot of education at this point. Another thing I just
One
wanted to mention really
question.
quickly, I just want to mention something really quickly, and that is that the penalties in the Illinois statute are per violation. And that came up when we were working on a pesticide exposure case that then led to Investigate Midwest doing a very expansive investigation of pesticide law in Illinois. And then the legislature then changed the penalties for pesticides of exposure to humans substantially. So in our case, the individual aerial companies received a fine from the state for $750. About 2 or 3 weeks ago, we found out that based on these new penalties, a aerial sprayer was fined $250,000 because applying the new penalties, it's per individual, and they sprayed near a local school. So when I saw the penalty in the Illinois statute per violation, it's not per person. So if 10 workers get sick, it looks like it could be as low as $1,000, right? But they're all working in the field, and it should be per individual violation. So that's from a legal perspective, that's an area that I think needs some thought.
Thank you so much for continuing to share your reflections, even as we move into the Q&A and folks are asking more questions.
Yeah, I see
I'm
now.
wondering, Lisa, maybe we only have 3 minutes left, so maybe we could get one question from the chat.
Yeah, I
We
can probably
do.
answer both of them, because the first one
Oh,
is, I
perfect.
don't know why Minnesota doesn't have a plan for outdoor workers. We have colleagues up there who we'll see at the National Farmworker Conference this fall. So I will ask them, because that plan in Minnesota has been in effect for many years. And so I'm not understanding, they have quite a number of farm workers there. I don't understand why they don't have one. It's a good question. And then the opposition to national heat rules and policies is coming from businesses. it's perceived as, if you have a lot of rest breaks because it's really hot, you're not going to be as efficient and you're not going to get as much work from the workers as you would otherwise. So I think it's mostly the Farm Bureau that's opposed to it. There were some interesting issues in the Illinois, as the Illinois one was working its way uh, through discussions. And that is that like some unions, because the Illinois one was indoor and outdoor, but some unions have plans that might be better than the state plan. So there were things written into the state legislation that said, if there's a union plan that's better, you can just rely on that. So that could be an opposition from a worker side, but generally, I think it's businesses that are concerned about productivity and efficiency.
Do we have time for one more question?
I can stay on.
Okay, cool. I have a question, I guess, about there's a lot of talk of reporting and everything. So it seems like Colorado has a way to report anonymously complaints. And Illinois has one for pesticides, but not for heat. How often do these violations like get investigated? Like, what does reporting look like in the state? Is there a centralized place to do that anonymously, or what would it take to get that in place? Do you think we need to have the legislation in place before we have like centralized mechanisms for reporting these violations?
Yeah, those are just all really excellent questions. If it were me, I would like the reporting to be part of the statute so that it's understood to be part of this whole plan that there's reporting. So I would hope that it doesn't follow, but it's part of either the legislation or when the rules come out. But reporting is in some of the other statutes, and so it's not unique necessarily to consider that it could be included in other statutes as well.
Thank you.
Perfect. And that brings us right to 1 o'clock. You all are so great at managing time. I just want to, before we close up, give a big round of applause to our speaker, Lisa Palumbo. Thank you so much for sharing everything with us today.
You're welcome.
And this session is recorded, so if folks want to come back to this session, there will be a video, we'll share it out. And we hope to see you all at our next session in September. Everyone have a great day, and thank you so
Have a nice
much.
day.